Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the January 18th iteration of the Militarized Equipment Ad Hoc. We have members of the community, members of the Police Commission, as well as members of the department. There is one additional member who people may or may not be familiar with. That is Ms. Dui Nguyen, who is Commission's counsel. Thank you for joining us. You are welcome to stay. You are welcome to go. No aspersions one way or the other. All right, so I thought that based on the recent city council actions taken just last night, that we might first start off by taking up the proposed amendments which city council sent back to us via resolution. These are part of, and I think what the city is doing is invoking their authority under 604 to make recommendations to the commission to look at particular policies. And so that is why we are taking them up. I do have some of them already redlined into some documents, but I wonder if that is the best way to go or how others may think is a good way to move forward. I'll take any suggestions, anyone.
No, I think like I said, just a central one document at a time, kind of address each one, go on. I think the department, it sounds like there is amenable to most of the changes. We just want to make sure that we do have something that's kind of achievable and that is consistent throughout if we have anything that we need to reconcile anywhere. So yeah, just one sort of share screen usually makes that easiest.
I just realized that I am on a Mac, so I can't, well, I'll figure it out, but Ms. Tu, go ahead.
Thanks. And just to run through that list, I believe that's K7 mutual aid, K6 rifles, I-26 robots, chemicals, and Sims. Is that right?
That is the list that I have, yes.
Okay,
The first three by resolution, the latter two by suggestion. Okay, well, if y'all will allow me, then I will just get started. Let's see. I'm going to start with case 7. I think that's the simplest one. Let's go to Safari, share. I apologize, the red line doesn't show up in the browser app, but the change is as noted in what I'll get that typo fixed where it says briefed. This is the paragraph that is proposed to be changed. The previous version said that essentially other departments are not permitted to use the militarized equipment in Oakland's jurisdiction unless they themselves have a militarized equipment use policy of some sort. This is the proposed amendment from City Council. I'll open it up to discussion. Senator Turner?
Yes, I think the chief might have some of the similar things, but just in terms of the, I think the second part, the department is in agreement that we are not going to, do not seek to, and are fine with not utilizing any mutual aid to bypass listed prohibitions, rules, procedures, our own rules. In terms of the first part, though, this is kind of the area where I think in terms of achievability, that perhaps we could do something like, and I know that Chief Allison has a lot of history with working with mutual aid, but something like a yearly way to interact with our mutual aid coordinator to provide our policies, especially since we know that they'll be examined every year through the impact reporting, the annual reporting, and just to provide those to that coordinator, to have them filtered out to any agency that might be called in to give us mutual aid, a little bit more achievable than necessarily a briefing at the beginning, especially when we're talking about more ad hoc type or dynamic type situations where outside agencies might be coming in for criminal activity or large scale operations inside the city of Oakland that we don't necessarily have a lot of time to pre-plan. But I will stop there and let the chief say his part.
Casey.
Thank you, Joe, and definitely good to hear and see everyone. So Joe summarized it well. I think the second line I think is good. More of a it's technical. I'd probably change in this training bulletin to in this policy, just because we have our general orders are different than training bulletins. So just from a manner of consistency, I think that would it wouldn't change the sum and substance of it. The first part of it, there are some scenarios where if we bring mutual aid, and crowd control is a prime example. And I know this idea behind briefing on policies before participating in a mutual aid activity actually originated during crowd control operations and some crowd control lawsuits where one of the things we needed to do was brief at staging, and we were absorbing, in some cases, hundreds of outside agency officers from our mutual aid region, which can span as far south as Monterey and as far north, I think, as Humboldt in the Region 2 area. So we were having the ability to brief. There are some situations where we may need outside agency assistance in a current emergency situation where rapid deployment, it may be less about an official mutual aid ask through the county, but maybe more of a mutual assistance type situation where an example is the shooting at the former King Estates in East Oakland a month or two ago, where we had an idea of an active shooter inside of a school, and we had CHP and Alameda County both on site assisting us. CHP might have been the first agency inside the school. So there are certain situations where we might do a collaborative operation, either in an emergency or in an agency, where a briefing at staging may not necessarily be feasible. And so I think what Joe was saying, what we've done in the past in anticipation of some of those types of agencies, even in crowd management, is we would work through the county mutual aid coordinator and we would email relevant policies. Then it was, use of force policies or crowd management policies. In this case, it would be the K7 policy along with the remaining 11, where we would maybe put in the policy that on an annual basis, we shall forward our relevant policies through the mutual aid coordinator for distribution around the mutual aid region, which is Region 2. So that was something, again, to make sure we operationalize it and we have the best swath of coverage. That was a suggestion we were discussing among staff.
Mr. Lindsay Poland.
So Sergeant Turner earlier said there's an importance in consistency between the policies. I am looking at, I guess it's a general order L3 on mutual aid. And it says specifically for outside units, lieutenant, sorry,
Awesome.
that specifically that prior to deployment, outside law enforcement units, prior to deployment, outside law enforcement mutual aid units shall respond to a staging area where they shall be briefed on the current situation, provided local maps, briefed on the unity of command structure and OPD, provided copies, briefed on and provided copies of applicable OPD policies. That suggests that there's already something in place for that briefing that is part of policy. I think sending something annually to the other departments, that's great. I mean, that sounds like it's a really good idea. But this would certainly be consistent with existing policy.
So let me ask, well, L3, isn't that specific to that provision that you're reading? Is that for all mutual aid or just specific to crowd control situations?
So it's under our mutual aid policy, and it was written after the fact when 3G was modified under one of our last, I think it was one of our last injunctions. and we needed to shore up how we communicate the staging, and it was then translated over into L3 as a general mutual aid policy. And what Mr. Lindsay Pullen was saying is absolutely right in L3, and certainly in thinking about it, there's potential exigency gaps. And in my mind, I mean, we may even have to, as we sit here and talk about what K7 should look like with the consideration of exigent circumstances, maybe even have to have a modification to L3 to absorb those opportunities as well.
Okay. Let me try to push this forward. Well, first, let me see. Any other thoughts, solutions? Anybody want to?
I see a hand from the public.
I do as well, and I think that I will take it. Let me start with Rachel Beck.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'm Rachel Beck. I'm a District 1 resident, and I've been following AB 481 and the policies written in response to it, in part because of the Oakland Tech students who were tear gassed after the march from school to downtown on June 1st of 2020. I'm very, very excited to see this new proposed language about outside agencies and how they'll be briefed, and specifically OPD's declaration that they will not attempt to circumvent policy by involving other agencies. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Next up is Omar Farmer.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you for all the work that you guys have put into this. And I also agree with the recommendations made by the community members, as well as other recommendations made by City Council. I don't think that the policies, how they have been written, specifically this one, appropriately safeguarded the public. And I just was curious, has there been any discussion regarding eliminating the use of tear gas? You know, when I was in the military as an emergency management officer on a base overseas, we didn't even use tear gas, and the military even got rid of the use of tear gas altogether. So I'm just wondering if that discussion has ever taken place here at the city of Oakland. And I also would love to see, we discussed this at our last militarized equipment ad hoc. I'd love to see OPD also invest more in incident command training for the people in those crowd control situations to get a better handle on those situations and to have more accountability on the different, force that's used and how they're managing the crowd. It would also be great to see maybe something more progressive occur, like I believe in Washington, D.C., for crowd control situations specifically, they invested in community organizations to help de-escalate those types of situations. And I think that would be appropriate. And we also do have a Department of Violence Prevention who has violence interrupters. I'm not sure if OPD uses those, those folks jointly in those situations, but I also think that would help better safeguard the public. That's all.
Thank you for your comment. Okay. We are going to get to the chemical agents policy in a sec. We'll talk more about some of your comments there. Let's turn back to the issue at hand. Okay. Okay, so I think we have agreement on the second sentence. So let's talk about what we're going to do with the first sentence. Or other sentences, period. So let's start with the first sentence. It does seem like, based on what Mr. Lindsay Pullen said, in L3, it does talk about the staging area and a briefing area. It sounds like that is part of your policy in L3. The main issue is that there are certain dynamic mutual aid situations where that may not be possible or may not be realistic. How do we capture that? How do how do we capture that? What do we do about that? And how do we make it work with this and L3? Lieutenant Turner?
So it sounds like the kind of the way to combine these two might be to instead of saying any mutual aid activity managed by OPD, which I think that the assistant chief has kind of noted some sort of outside assistance, sort of cooperation that happens when you have multiple overlapping jurisdictions adjacent to jurisdictions that's going to happen, and sort of the difference between that and what I think most people on this call would kind of think about in terms of mutual aid and what we hear when we hear the public comments. So we talk about mainly crowd control, things like that. So something where it would say that we would brief them when OPD activates mutual aid or planned mutual aid. I'm not sure if planned really captures everything that we want to talk about. So maybe when mutual aid specifically is activated pursuant to the county or mutual aid manager policies, then that provides a little bit more clear direction for when we are spinning up these larger things, but then also allows for a little bit more flexibility when we understand that there is going to be some cross-jurisdictional work just inherent in the fact that we're part of a Bay Area that has many different law enforcement jurisdictions.
Okay. While I work on getting that language, Commissioner Jordan, Vice Chair Jordan, sorry.
We can stay with Commissioner in these meetings. I don't really care. So as Lieutenant Turner noted, and as we heard in both sort of both of the public comment just a few moments ago, a lot of what we think about when we think about this particular item is crowd control and or sort of like First Amendment situations. And so in the past, we have just referenced back to the policy that pertains to. I get that this pertains to additional things, but we may as well just state it outright and say, under crowd control circumstances, mutual aid, other law enforcement organizations shall be briefed in accordance with, L3, and we can just sort of link back to that. We've done that in a number of other circumstances where we just want to draw attention that there is language that exists. We don't need to sort of reinvent the wheel. And then we can spell out the nuance in those circumstances, as Lieutenant Turner noted, that are more dynamic and be more specific around those things. But I think that just sort of noting that, like, yes, under crowd control, there is a policy. We can just link back to that exists. We don't need to discuss it here necessarily. Does that feel reasonable for folks?
I have a feeling that you're about to get opinions on that, but give me 1 second and let me ask the question. In terms of OPD's mutual aid deployments, what percentage of them are crowd control situations versus other situations? So we get a sense of scale.
So I would say if it was a couple of years ago and beyond, I'd say probably crowd management was the overarching. But as of late, it hasn't been as much crowd management. It would be either tactical operations, or it would be, although not very often, in the moment situation, such as the school shooting I referenced earlier. So it would be more less crowd control and more tactical. But a few years ago, it was more crowd control than tactical. So it does kind of change with the things we're seeing in the city.
As I follow up a little bit on that, by tactical operations, you mean what exactly?
So it could be a SWAT team maybe needing to serve a warrant for multiple individuals involved in shootings that are at different locations, and we can only, as an Oakland Police Department, serve a search warrant at one, and we need the assistance of other agencies, whether it's federal partners or local partners, to help us serve warrants at the other locations. So whether it's San Leandro, Fremont, ATF, FBI, coming in and serving multiple simultaneous warrants is a scenario that can be an operation where it's not technically triggered under mutual aid, because mutual aid is a very formalized process that works through the county, but it could be cooperative work between agencies to support one another.
Does that include the multiple interagency task force that OPD is part of?
It could be investigations arising out of task force work, or it could be investigations that arise, locally. But we need assistance from other jurisdictions because of the scope and scale of what we're trying to achieve. Or it could be an emergent situation, again, a business shooting, school shooting, local shooting, where there's other jurisdictions that operate within our city that hear the issues or concerns or the crimes, go out over the radio and self-deploy to the location to provide support or assistance.
Much appreciated. Okay, with that backdrop, Mr. Lindsay Poland.
Yeah, I was anticipating, in fact, that perhaps the other most important deployments where this would apply would be tactical or SWAT team deployments that are frequently planned, and where outside agencies have much less restrictive policies. So there's another piece of the mutual aid policy which I didn't read, but it says, prior to deployment, outside law enforcement units shall respond to a designated staging area where their less lethal weapons and munitions will be inventoried, and they will be told which weapons and munitions are prohibited according to departmental policy. If the intent of the department right now is actually to loosen that policy, it would be very disturbing. What I heard from the city council last night is an instruction for this language, essentially, unless there's some serious problem with it. And also an instruction, or an intent to work with the sheriff's office, who does have some of this equipment, and is, I don't know, you can tell me how frequent the sheriff's office comes into Oakland on mutual aid versus other agencies, but to reach out to the new leadership of that agency to ensure that OPD and that agency are on the same page. So if the intent of the department is actually to loosen existing policy on instructing outside, on briefing outside agencies on mutual aid, I don't know. I'm a little flabbergasted, to be honest. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but that's what it sounds like to me. It's like you're saying, actually, the current policy is problematic. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, we're certainly not going to have inconsistent policies. That doesn't make any sense. But it sounds like it would not work that well if we limited this particular section to crowd control situations specifically. AC Allison.
Thank you. And I just also want to be clear, I'm not opposed to the first line. I think that, anytime you can brief agencies and give them as much clarity and mission as possible, we're good for it. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the day, I believe the L3 policy occurred after one of the last updates to the crowd control policy, and it does incorporate a lot of language like Pathfinder language, which is a very crowd control specific type operation and language, and it does have that crowd control feel on it. And I think that, briefing at staging and talking about downing certain weapons, gas munitions and impact munitions, that is in alignment with 3G is a good thing. But I think, as we are talking about this, and I look at L3 and I look at this policy, there is a gap. There is, and I know I don't want to play semantics with it, but there is, mutual aid, which is an official mutual aid asked through the county. You might not get the county to respond, but you might get agencies who will answer the call. If I ask for, 16 officers to support whatever operation, in the moment, we get what we get. Then there's pre-planned operations that might not be mutual aid. It may be a request for neighboring agencies to provide support that isn't necessarily triggered through Cal OES and mutual aid process. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out how we can shore up a gap that admittedly probably is in L3 that needs to be shored up is keep what we have the briefings at staging on those operations that are planned, that are, have that allotment of time, but without losing the ability to recognize an exigent circumstance. And I certainly don't want exigency to become the rule of the day or the standard and not the exception. But have a way to have assistance when there is a risk of life safety issue that we need assistance. That might not necessarily be mutual aid, but be more a mutual agency assist because of the gravity of the situation that would not necessarily give rise to, okay, let's stop and let me brief you on a number of policies. And again, that's why I suggested not changing the first line, but having a caveat, and maybe that gap is bridged by this plus an annual distribution to outside or agencies through the mutual aid coordinator, so they have forward-leaning awareness at a minimum to be able to safety net any emergencies. And then certainly, L3 could be added, so there is consistency of the policy, again, not making it looser, but adding consistency to deal with the exigent circumstances where we can change the language here in K7, also update L3 to allow for that. So that's all I'm suggesting. Definitely not loosening or adding it, but to allow for life safety measures that don't happen very often where we need that kind of assistance, but certainly made itself known just in the last couple months at the school. So I just want to make sure we contemplate that.
Ms. Tu?
One of the things that I heard President Bass say last night was a primary reason for her to bring this resolution to council is her concerns about whether it meets the state requirements for the governing body to make a determination around whether it will safeguard the public safety and welfare and civil rights and civil liberties. And that was a concern that she had, and she included the mutual aid section because of that. And I'm wondering, as we talk about this and as we look at this, what the department is looking for in terms of something that can fulfill that direction from City Council. But be more workable for the constraints that they're experiencing. And one thing I'm also thinking about is they have the department has a lot more context around what those constraints are, and I don't know if getting some help in unpacking those constraints into language that would offer better safeguards would be helpful.
I think that question was, how are you going to change L3 to make sure that this gap the exception doesn't swallow the rule?
Yeah, so I think what we would probably continue to do is make it very clear and set forth in L3 examples exactly of what a mutual aid deployment ordered or requested by the department is, and clearly differentiate that between some of these things that I know, my fellow lieutenants, sergeants, those who are sort of making decisions on the fly need to do. So for instance, to avoid having an issue where say we had some sort of perimeter or whatever in Emeryville or near to the border of Emeryville, the Emeryville police say, hey, you've got a hole in your perimeter, we'll fill that hole in. They fill it in, everything goes fine, but then it's like, well, actually, Lieutenant Turner, you didn't brief them on these things, so you violated policy. All right, I think the context that we have at least is we try and not set our staff up for failure. We try and set them up for success. So, yeah.
Mr. Lindsay Pollard.
Yeah, a question, actually, maybe two questions even. One is the information that some outside agency activity in Oakland is not through a mutual deployment suggests that there might be a different kind of gap. Because this was, I think this was framed on the idea that, okay, there are some agencies that have jurisdiction in Oakland where Oakland is not asking them in, right? And those can't be encompassed in this particular thing because they're going to come in by their own decision. But there are others which I think the thought was that was mutual aid, where Oakland is inviting them in. What I'm hearing tonight is that there are some additional situations that are not mutual aid, where Oakland is inviting in an outside agency. I think I heard that. And so the first question is whether the commissioners and the department would be willing to write this with however it's going to come out on the rest of it, if there's going to be exigency or not, but to encompass any situation where Oakland is inviting in, or as this says, coordinating with other jurisdictions, so that it's not only mutual aid. So that was the first question. The second question is, when mutual aid is activated, how long does that actually usually take? How many minutes or hours or days, or like, what are we talking about here in terms of a time when mutual aid is invoked? Just to understand what time there may or may not be for a briefing.
Assistant Chief.
So Mr. Lindsay Pollard actually brought something to mind as he was talking. I think maybe a way, before I get to the second question, to frame it is, I have L3 up, I'm trying to look through, and I don't know if it kind of defines mutual aid. It just talks about, requests being made through CalEMA and the emergency management system, and then it's a voluntary sharing of resources to respond to an unusual occurrence. So maybe there is a way to even crystallize that definition for planned operations, requests that are going to be made in advance, and not necessarily to what Lieutenant Turner was saying is a deployment kind of in the moment because you're a neighboring jurisdiction. So that could be a way to add kind of context without changing anything, but just defining mutual aid. So coming to an agreement on that. And as far as requests, so the way, I'll give you an example, because mutual aid, again, just doesn't happen with crowd management. It could happen with any number of things. You could have a serious incident in the city of Oakland that draws resources, and parts of the city might not have any police presence for emergencies. And so, you could also request mutual aid for agencies to come in and just provide a public safety presence in an area because all of OPD went to another location. So if you're looking for crowd control, depending on the time, day or night, it could be anywhere from an hour to a 4-hour response. And again, it depends on the number of resources, how far they're coming from. We've had incidents where we've requested mutual aid in First Amendment demonstrations where mutual aid came from Monterey. And so that obviously takes time to gear up, brief, and drive up. And certainly when they come here, they go through a staging process where we do weapons inspections and briefings and policy, because it is crowd management, and we've been under several injunctions for crowd management. There's been times where it was daytime and we had an incident happen in one part of the city that drew all the patrol resources, and the incident commander or the watch commander at the time requested support for patrol in another part of the city, because we're still having 911 calls, that they went through the mutual aid system where, you got to call the county and the county asks for whoever's available to come in. And in that stance, because it was during the day, during the week, you'd get a more rapid response, within less than an hour to be able to fill a need. So I think it's depending upon when the request is made. It's usually going to be in the moment. Typically, mutual aid doesn't come in the form of a pre-planned operation, because part of the mutual aid requirements is that in that moment you've exhausted all of the police resources. However, and I kind of put an asterisk there, is it could be pre-planned if it's a prolonged event, or there's been several events that have exhausted resources and you're anticipating more events, whether it's a natural disaster, like a storm or an earthquake, or an event that could be several days of crowd management, or a prolonged, say we have a barricaded individual, our tactical team responds, they're holding for 12, 13, 14 hours, and there's fatigue that's setting in and we need relief because it hasn't been resolved and we need to bring in another tactical team. So it could be in the moment, it could be a rapid response, it could be hours of response. So it just, again, the situation, the number of resources, and the location of the support all kind of play into the time of response and the time of deployment.
So I'll recap where we are. At the moment, the proposed language by City Council, it seems like there is agreement as to it being in this document. I've added an additional line, which would state that the department shall provide an annual update to local mutual aid jurisdictions on this policy and other policies relevant to reasonable mutual aid activity, to capture the annual update for those dynamic situations, as for now, the best way that we can with this policy begin to address the gap that is currently being fleshed out. I don't think we're going to answer this tonight because it sounds like it's going to start requiring an overhaul of L3, which frankly is a document from 2013 and not the subject of this particular ad hoc, although I know City Council is interested in taking a look at mutual aid more generally and may even recommend it coming back. Before I finish up with my thoughts, Ms. Tu.
Just very quick, training bulletin. I think the department had suggested changing that to policy, or something that more captures all of it.
Casey.
The first paragraph, the last two words, training bulletin, that's
Yes.
yeah, that, because essentially it'd go into a general order, not training. It's, I know, kind of, or we have a weird way of naming our policies, but I would just say this policy.
Or in the military equipment use policy.
And then can we add, when it says the department shall also provide an annual update to local mutual aid jurisdiction on this policy and other policies relevant to this reasonable mutual aid activity through the county mutual aid coordinator? Obviously there are, I think, I want to say seven counties in our mutual aid region, maybe more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, actually more, a lot more. Probably 15 counties. So having emailing all the counties and all the police departments within those counties could be a daunting task on an annual basis, but we would go through the mutual aid coordinator to make sure they get distributed.
How do we make sure that those departments read the policies?
That is a good question.
That's why the briefing is necessary. To be
Well,
honest,
I could see it in two ways. It could be the briefing, or it could be an acknowledgement by each department that they have issued some sort of notice about those policies. Which way do you all want to do it?
or both.
I'll let y'all think about that. What I would suggest is we have the language that we have here. as what we're sending back in K7. K7. Right, K7. And that you also, because we are talking a little bit about process, and I'm taking notes, or I hope someone's taking notes, better notes than me, that we make a recommendation to City Council that we're realizing from this discussion some of the gaps that are in the mutual aid policy, and some suggestions as to how we might address that, or have things, or things to take a look at. How does that sound? Okay, let me put it this way. Any strong objections? Okay. Anybody? Okay, trying to chart a path forward. Sorry to sort of push through. But can we move on to the next set? Thank you. Yeah.
Where we have, and I hate to be stickler about this, but other policies relevant to reasonable mutual aid activity. I feel like that might be read as pretty broad and therefore might overcommit us to sharing almost any policy around equipment use. So I suggest that we either just reference like the 3 policies that are written below, or try to, I would say, descope that a little bit.
How about policies relevant to militarized equipment? Since we know what that is, we have kind of the 11 or 12 policies that are all associated with that.
That works.
Let me just check one thing, that we have a definition for militarized equipment, military equipment. Okay. Military or controlled equipment. That's going to be the language.
Yeah. Thank you.
Military equipment. Excellent. Thank you all. Okay. K6. So I recall there being in K6 three specific areas, 2 or 3. The first is, let's go to prohibited use first, since I think that's a little bit more straightforward. If I can find it, sorry about all my scrolling. Prohibited uses. This is patrol rifles, and I added F and G at the bottom there. So it'd be these 2 sections. Thoughts? I'm mainly looking at the department here.
So I'll go real quick. I don't have a problem with the deploy shall not deploy for recruitment, public relations, or promotional activities. Unless anybody else in the department has any other suggestions or ideas, that's not something that caused me great concern. And I'm not opposed to having rifles not being deployed in general for crowd management purposes. I think, again, this goes into a definitional piece of it is, when we say crowd control, are we referring to First Amendment activities? I'm assuming so, that's referring to, but there can certainly be crowds that form at crime scenes that are violent crime. So I may want to make sure that we don't get caught up into different interpretations of language. We all sit here and kind of probably we know what the intent is, but the policy is always going to probably all surpass us, and I want to try to avoid any kind of other interpretation. So if it's rifles should not be deployed for crowd control purposes that are defined under 3G, maybe adding that if that is kind of the point of it. And then I would just say, you know, I always hate to have a you shall not always or you shall always type absolutes, because again, I think about situations where one of our last demonstrations, well, I would say last demonstrations, but demonstrations a couple of years ago, there was an actual shooting proximate to the demonstration that ended up shifting over to the shooting scene where 2 federal security officers were shot, 1 was killed, where there could be lethal encounters where rifles may end up needing to be deployed given the circumstances. So point 1, I absolutely agree. We do not use rifles to clear crowds or control crowds. That's something I absolutely agree with. I think that is particularly with First Amendment activities. But I think there needs to be some kind of thought that if there is a threat to life, like not just, you know, someone's getting assaulted, you know, physically, but like an actual lethal threat to life, where it requires police intervention, that there needs to be some kind of language that will allow for that potential situation.
Mr. Lindsay Poland.
So I think it's an important distinction that not for crowd control purposes is different from saying is prohibited in crowd control situations. Because as you just said, the department wouldn't use them in order to control or manage crowds. If there is a sideshow with a crowd and there's criminal activity, there's a shooter in the crowd, you're not going to use the rifle to control the crowd. That's not the purpose. The purpose is to respond to the shooter. So I think that's an important piece here, the crowd control purposes. If you limit it to 3G and First Amendment protest activity, but you have other types of crowds that are not considered First Amendment expression by whatever interpretation, then you open it up to say that the rifle is going to be used to control that crowd. It's about purpose.
Commissioner Jackson Castaigne.
I think John Lindsay Poland basically said everything that my comment was going to be. I think drawing the distinction is important. I was also thinking about incidents such as like a sideshow or even like large festivals or other types of large gatherings where there could be the potential for violence to break out. And so I think drawing the distinction between using the rifle to control the crowd or versus responding in a to something that's already actually occurred. I think if we can include language that draws that distinction, that might be helpful.
Lieutenant Turibio.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? I'm on a pretty weak connection.
We got you.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're in line here with understanding it's probably a verbiage thing. I propose something simple like, you know, rifles shall not be deployed for the specific purpose of clearing or controlling a crowd. I think that explicitly states that deployment is purpose driven and, you know, not just in the event that a certain event is occurring that precludes the deployment of the rifle. So making it purpose driven, I think should cover this.
Vice Chair Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Chief Allison had to say and what John had to say were essentially 2 sides of the same coin. I do think that I think the concern here is that we all have there's this image of police officers with assault rifles standing around sort of glowering at protesters or any group of people who are assembled and not actively sort of addressing a situation that might call for deadly force. And so that is the thing we want to remove, right? I think that what was just said about not for crowd management or dispersal, but also maybe should be noted that, crowd or assault rifles or patrol rifles may only be used to address specific situations that call for force. If this is in relation to a crowd control situation, as opposed to the sort of kind of loitering with scary weapons piece, which I think is what everybody's real fear is here. Because I don't think that any of us think that OPD at this stage of the game is going to clear a crowd with an assault rifle, given the amount of conversation we've had about this, and so we just want to sort of address that and be as specific as possible, right?
Miss two.
I was going to suggest that we take a look at the definitions for crowd management, crowd control in 3G, the policy on crowd control, but I noticed that you've got a lot of language on your screen, which I'm really liking the direction of. And I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit more about that.
I'll hear from Assistant Chief before I do that.
Thank you. And I just two things. One, just to kind of highlight 3G. 3G doesn't just cover First Amendment activities. It does cover many crowd events, including sporting events, festivals, concerts, celebratory crowds, and demonstrations. So the only reasons I was suggesting 3G is because it would be applicable to a lot of different crowd scenarios. But I do like Lieutenant Toribio's suggestion, and with a simple suggestion of just changing the language instead of using crowd control, which, again, a lot of in people's mind's eye could go towards immediately demonstrations, but just being more purpose driven to say that rifles will not be used to clear or manage crowds would be very direct. And I think in everybody's mind would know exactly what that means, regardless of what type of crowd it is.
Okay. Lieutenant Toribio, do you still have your hand up? Are you complete, as President Bass says?
Yes, sorry, I'll lower the hand now. Sorry about that.
Or is Vice Chair Jordan? I'll get it.
Yeah, I think that probably covers most of it. I guess my main concern is when we start, when and if this happens, in which there is a crowd, say a sideshow, and OPD responds to shots fired with patrol rifles, and there is footage on the internet, cell phone footage on the internet of OPD standing around post action or during a planning phase, clearly around a crowd with assault rifles, and how do we make it clear that it is that is the specific, because we have to be I'm not trying to protect OPD, I'm trying to protect the sort of clarity of how we manage disciplinary issues if this isn't followed, and if it becomes muddied because there's this public perception piece where we're saying, well, we're not using the weapons to clear the crowd, but we are in a crowd of people with patrol rifles, which may have the effect of clearing the crowd. And so where do we, I think it's important to note that the rifles are only to be used, not only are they not to be used to clear a crowd, but they are only to be used to address a potentially deadly situation, if at all, during any sort of crowd related activities, because it's sort of two pieces of the same issue.
Lieutenant Toribio?
Yeah, if I'm processing this correctly, I think it's there's an interest that's being raised to be able to cover some sort of either liability or like a perception issue of rifles that are deployed during like a crowd control situation, but not for the purpose of controlling the crowd. I don't know if I have an answer for that, but I certainly don't. I mean, I just don't think that K6 is where that's gonna be resolved. I don't know. I don't have much to say beyond that. I do think that the language that's been noted here does address the purpose for when the rifles are deployed. In addition to that being listed here in the prohibited section, we have the authorized use section, which is overarching also under K3. So I think we're good with this language here. If there is a perception issue or an interest in mitigating when perceptive complaints come in that we're a militarized group who are in the field when there's a demonstration. I think that at least in that regard, we're accepting of those complaints already. I don't think that's nothing changes in that regard.
Lieutenant Turner.
Yeah, thanks. Just and also for Commissioner or Vice Chair Jordan, I think that's yeah, in terms of the accountability piece, I think that we probably could cover that just with in the policy as written already. It does have a requirement saying that rifles shall be returned to the vehicle or place of storage as soon as practical after the purpose for deployment has been resolved. So we already kind of have a understanding that could be an issue. It would have to be kind of figured out whether that was followed, but there is a rule already in place basically saying that if something like that happens, a crowd situation is occurring, something within the crowd causes the officers to deploy rifles. Once the purpose for deployment has been resolved, there is already a requirement in the policy to return those. And I know that we teach, at least for the officers, to be pretty diligent about that, precisely because of the perception that these weapons can have.
How does the department feel about language similar to what we have in the crowd control policy 3G, specific to riot helmets? Specifically where it says crowd control helmets shall not be used unless there is an articulable reason to wear them in public view. And I'm mainly talking about this situation, the crowd control situation. Lieutenant Turbia.
Maybe I'm not seeing the parallel there, because I understand the riot helmet. It's like in both cases, I think it's a matter of purpose, right? I don't think anybody disagrees that if the item itself is something that appears as like threatening, its deployment by existence, it's gonna be perceived bad regardless of its purpose. And again, I just go back to I think what the focus of this DGO is purpose, authorized, prohibited uses, used, etc.
Lieutenant Turbio, did you finish? Did we lose you?
Yeah, I finished. Sorry, I don't know if I cut out.
Just a little bit. I think we got it though.
Okay.
Okay. And the reason why I appreciate that view, because the reason I think that one of the facets of this particular piece, I think, is along the same lines of why we have that line in the crowd control policy, and why we have the line that's right above it about not being deployed for recruitment, public relations, or promotional activities. We don't want the first thing to happen when there is a crowd for OPD to show up with rifles deployed without an articulable reason. And so that's why I bring up that particular question. Lieutenant Rubio?
Yeah, thanks. I think that already in policy under, can't remember the section. Let me see if I have it pulled up here. It's under, bear with me, please. Under, I think, section 9, authorized deployment. So, kind of the overarching thing here is that there's actually a statement in the first paragraph where deploying members have to be able to articulate how deployment of a rifle, provides that tactical advantage in favor of officer and public safety. So maybe it's there should be like a recall to a prior section, or maybe it's just implied already because it is listed here that the things in the prohibited uses or any statements in the prohibited use area or any other area is also in conjunction with obviously the rest of the document to include most obviously the authorized deployment section. So I think it sort of is covered already. It's kind of is similar to the discussions we had earlier about use and deployment and how the overall kind of spirit of using this as a tool fell under a different DGO, right? So I think, instead of trying to encompass the entirety of an idea just in this prohibited use section, taking into context the scope of the entire document.
Okay, got it. Mr. Lindsay Poland.
Yeah, there's a question in the Q&A, the written Q&A that someone might want to take up that's related to this. But I had a question about what is written, and I think Commissioner Shea, you wrote this: regardless of the incident at hand, the use of rifles is a use of force and subject to principles of de-escalation and limitations imposed by DGO 3. I'm not sure what the intent was here, but the use of rifles, the AB 41 has the terminology use as distinct from use of force. In the language of AB 41, use in general is more meaning of deployment. And so I'm not sure what the intent was here, because it sounds like you're saying the deployment of rifles is a use of force, or maybe it's the firing or pointing of rifles is a use of force. So I just wanted to say that because I think if we begin to conjoin the language of use and use of force, it can be a bit confusing. In my mind, use is a broader category.
Thank you for that. Any other comments about this section for these two prohibitions? Okay. I will take very briefly some of the participant questions. Let me start with Eleanor Levine.
Oh, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go right ahead.
Yeah, this is a little more technical than I'm able to fully grasp, but I just want to make sure that the discussion that we're having about the use of rifles in crowds, this also is applicable to outside law enforcement agencies that are part of mutual aid, that they would be bound by the same language that OPD is in the use of rifles at crowd control, or whatever.
Let me thank you for your question. Let me direct that to Assistant Chief.
Thank you, Commissioner, and for the community. So the officially from a mutual aid perspective, if mutual aid is being deployed for operational purposes, I don't have the exact quote in the CalEMA guidance, but it's along the lines of, from a deployment standpoint, they fall under the incident command of the agency that's requesting mutual aid. So if, you know, we asked for an agency to come in and support something, and we wanted them to go to, you know, the corner of 14th and Broadway to do a police action, and they said, no, we want to go to West Grand and Telegraph, they couldn't do that. They fall under the command and direction of the incident commander. There is a section though that allows agencies to follow their own force policies. Obviously, all policies have to be within the law, but it gives them that kind of ability to operate with the understanding that agencies are equipped differently, they train differently, they have different policies, they have to report to their own city governance as well as their own city attorney for liability. So it would fall under as far as what K7 authorizes, in the sense of we would brief them with the new language, we would brief them on our policies, and we wouldn't certainly use them as a way to circumvent our policy. So if we knew we had to clear a crowd and we really, really wanted to use rifles, K7 would prohibit us as a department, because that's what we can control, deploying the outside agency to a crowd with their rifles as a way to clear that crowd, because we can't do it. So that prohibition would not allow us to do it. So we can't tell an agency you can't deploy your rifles, but what we can do is not place the agency in a position that would circumvent the policy knowingly in that regard. I hope that kind of makes sense. It's a lot of little nuances.
It sure is. All right, next up is Omar Farmer.
Hey, sorry, I'm doing a walk with my dog up a hill. But I was glad to hear incident command come back up, because that was on my mind as well. And I feel like the department was receptive to potentially having an incident command policy when we discussed it a couple of years ago. And I know when myself and another member of the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force wrote a recommendation for create a crowd control ordinance, specifically put in there incident command section, which I feel, I'm not sure about these policies, if there's anything like that, or to extent that the incident commander is mentioned in them, but I feel like that better safeguards the public, because at a minimum, you ensure by having the incident command watch stood up that the senior person on scene is making the decisions, or you can take it a step further regarding this whole rifle deployment thing for a tough decision. In my experience, sometimes you have to call, the commanding officer or something. So maybe in this situation, you might want to call the chief of police or the assistant chief in this respect. So I just wanted to add that in. That's all.
Thank you for your input. Next up, Rachel Beck.
Hi. There was some question at council yesterday about whether the existing recruitment video OPD has recorded would violate the provision against using rifles in recruitment materials.
Thank you for that. I was going to go back to it. Thank you. Okay. So let's start with section sub G. Sorry about my dog. What I would propose is what I have pulled directly from 3G. And it talks, good Lord, what is happening? Sorry. And it is language that I have reproduced below so that you all see where it came from. When we talk about in 3G SIM, specialty impact munitions, it says specifically, no OPD police officer shall use direct fired specialty impact less lethal munitions for purposes of crowd management, crowd control, or crowd dispersal in connection with any demonstration or crowd event in the city of Oakland. That is language that we have approved. And so I think it makes sense in this policy to have very similar language to mirror that, which is what we have here. Rifles shall not be deployed for purposes of crowd management, crowd control, or crowd dispersal in connection with any demonstration or crowd event in the city of Oakland. I think that this gets specific enough so that we don't have a situation where where it gives OPD some flexibility and gets really at what it is that we're talking about, which is we don't want rifles used to disperse a crowd in any way, shape, or form, whether it's firing or presenting or deploying in some way. Could I have some thoughts about this?
I think this looks fine.
I agree. I like it.
I'm good with the Lieutenant Toribio. Any thoughts on your end? I know you're the SME on it.
No, nothing to add. I think that's more than adequate.
Mr. Lindsay Poland, this too. Not quite crowd control purposes, but it gets specific enough.
I like the first sentence. For the second one, I'm wondering, sorry, the first sentence being rifles shall not be deployed for purposes of crowd management, crowd control, crowd dispersal. For the second sentence, I'm thinking about Mr. Lindsay Poland's earlier comment about use versus deployment, and wondering if there's some slight word shifting there that could reflect that better.
It seems to me that if you lifted the thing directly from 3G that says nothing about a crowd control situation eliminates the changes or any of the constraints and criteria, that's a more clear statement.
A question, and this is, I feel like I should know this, but so under K03, drawing your sidearm is considered use of force, correct?
No.
No. Okay. Pointing is so drawing, but not pointing. Okay. So in this situation, if we're saying deployment of a patrol rifle would be covered, like any use of a patrol rifle would be covered under use of force, but deploying it and just sort of like having it on standby is not necessarily considered a use of force.
It's not considered a use of force. It is something that is that's controlled by the authorized uses and then also tracked. So we do track as well drawing our firearms. We want to make that clear. Just because it's not considered a reportable use of force, it's still something that's tracked. Same way with the rifles. So that anytime that they are deployed, I think what this is saying is more use in terms of firing or pointing them at people. Sure. Anytime they are deployed, that is controlled by the authorized use in terms of authorized when we can even deploy these, not even whether or not we could point or fire.
Right. So yes. Okay. So I just wanted to be clear that, because if we're talking about swapping out use for deployment for use, deployment is still, can be sort of pulling it out of storage, out of locked storage, and having it on standby. Though that might be tracked, it is not necessarily considered a use of force. And so I just wonder where that leaves us sort of in our thinking around this.
I would propose taking out this second sentence that I have just ad hoc written and taking Mr. Lindsay Poland's suggestion of adding the second sentence there about nothing about a crowd control situation eliminates or changes any of the constraints and criteria governing the use of lethal force in DGO K3, recognizing that this paragraph is in our K6 policy, which is a much larger document than what we're looking at today.
Although I would say that subject to the principles of de-escalation is a useful addition, assuming that's also in K3.
I don't have a good way of doing that without making it a very clunky sentence, but I will see what I can do.
I would keep just that sentence, nothing about, because the department's use of force policy does require de-escalation. They are one and the same.
Okay. Let me think about this before I send it back to the commission. Let's keep going. Let's keep going, but it's, just make a quick note about this. We still have one other thing in DGOK 6 to look at. Escalation. Sorry to be doing this on the fly. All right, the other section is on page 9. It is authorized deployment. And I'm glad that we are taking this one up next because this is going to be showing up a few times. Let's see. It's just paragraph 4. Paragraph 5 was a note to myself, so I apologize for that. The section is commanders shall make every effort to avoid the deployment of patrol rifles in the presence of minors, the elderly, medically compromised people, people with physical, mental, or intellectual disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, or other vulnerable people, as defined in DGOK 03. Thoughts, discussion, please. Lieutenant Toribio.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I thought this had been discussed prior, and I think what was mentioned about this was the language as is essentially sounds like it precludes rifles from being deployed in the presence of any of these populations. And considering what the tool is and what it's being deployed for, I think the wording here makes it completely restrictive, because if a commander shall make every effort upon learning that there is a vulnerable population involved, the effort is simply, as a commander saying no rifles are going to be deployed here. And that, I think, is a detriment to the community, really. If we're deploying this for the purposes of protecting life and mitigating loss of life, I just see it as very problematic.
Mr. Lindsay Poland.
I think the council was pretty clear on this, but this is language that was lifted directly from the armored vehicle policy. And it is not a prohibition. It is clearly not a prohibition. Armored vehicles are deployed in the presence of members of those populations. But the idea is, if you have an alternative, that's what you do. If you can do it later, if you can do it at a different place where the subject is, that's every effort. So, armored vehicles have been deployed in response to emergency situations twice a week for a number of years now, including when this policy was in place. I don't think they've actually been deployed any less often than they were before. So I'm puzzled as to how this is that different. And also do think that the council was pretty clear on this.
So I'll start off by saying the council is the council, but we are the body that's going to be discussing and making a decision about this. But I definitely take that direction. But let me also ask from a higher level perspective, sorry, dogs again. What am I trying to say? So let's say from a discipline perspective, since we have members of management and command staff here, what sorts of situations do you see where someone would violate policy in this way with this particular paragraph.
So I think that, you know, the concern is that, and I think what Lieutenant Trevio is kind of trying to encapsulate is the different perspectives on sort of every effort and what was reasonable in terms of what we asked. I remember, and Mr. Lindsay Poland, you referenced a time when you saw the officers out near you know, the church on Grant, and they were searching for, you know, for someone, and you expressed pretty strongly that you didn't believe that it was necessary for them to have their rifles at that point, that the crime really wasn't of a degree of sufficiency. You know, it would be at that point when we, you know, those differences of opinion, you know, at the same time where it's, on the one hand, the department might say we wanted to attempt to resolve this situation by taking this person into custody or dealing with this. On the other hand, someone might say, you know, there were members of vulnerable populations within the area. The neighborhood has children. The department could have disengaged, dealt with this person at a later time. It's there are, you know, these difference of opinions, and really that kind of leads to some of the issues that I think we see. So with the armored vehicle, understanding that is a larger piece of equipment that does need a lot more pre-planning, even in sort of these situations that are ad hoc that we have kind of planned for. It still requires someone to go back to the station to get it, things like that. Whereas the rifles we do have as a tool mainly to deal with people with firearms, and we see the department trying as much as possible to prioritize crimes involving firearms. That, you know, this is understanding that is a balancing act, that we are at the same time sort of bringing tools that do both sort of talk about violence and could entail violence to a situation to try and curtail violence. So it is difficult to understand that, but I think what this kind of does lead to is that sort of chilling effect, I think, is what you're hearing from Lieutenant Trevio. Whether or not that's the intent, that's probably where I would see it.
Vice Chair.
I think that protecting and being cognizant of vulnerable populations is always important for the police department in any aspect of their jobs. And I am very much in favor of protecting vulnerable populations. That said, this does feel like a very wide swath of humanity. How would a commander even know if people with limited English proficiency were, you know, adjacent to where patrol rifles were being used? I'm not sure how you would ascertain that to sort of make every effort. I guess if you were aware, I understand that, but it also, I guess my concern is that this is, the phrasing of this feels, it feels a little bit problematic in how in its lack of precision, potentially, specifically when we're talking about disciplinary issues, because, you know, could this be used, you know, you would have to sort of, I guess, prove that a commander knew that there were people with, you know, that fell into one of these populations for certain, and that they did not make an effective effort to avoid this. In some ways, that feels a little bit symbolic. Like, yeah, I think we all agree that we should avoid taking deadly action around vulnerable populations, specifically children, the people with mental health challenges, you know, and so forth. But I just feel like this is, it's a little bit broad, and it concerns me potentially. Like, is it useful? And if it is used, can it just be applied to almost any situation? Because given the sort of diversity in the city, I imagine that there would be almost no situation in which you might not be sort of around one of these populations potentially. I thoughts about how it could be, made more precise might be helpful.
Assistant Chief.
Thank you, Commissioner, and Vice Chair Jordan. I agree with them. I kind of took a lot of the things I was thinking out. Is I think as kind of a value statement, I don't disagree. I think you definitely want to protect our vulnerable populations. As an operational statement, which when you have the shall into it, then now it's like you commander have to do this, and what is this? And I know Mr. Lindsay Pullen gave scenarios of if there's other means and other situational considerations, but I know I don't say some, a lot of the time our rifles are deployed during open area searches. They're in neighborhoods, and in neighborhoods you have multiple houses with anybody in those houses, and I think there's no reasonable way to really know who's around in an area when you're dealing with a specific issue. I think that has to be something that there's always consideration of, but the shall make every effort does add a high bar to a tool that is probably utilized, I'd imagine, more often than the armored vehicle. I know Ted Turner mentioned that the armored vehicle does take time. We don't, and our policy clearly states, patrol the armored vehicle. So where we need it, it's go back and get it. And there's certain obvious levels of discussion and thinking about, okay, what's the overarching need for it? Whereas officers are patrolling every day with their rifle in their car, and they may come across a situation where they have to go do a yard search and there's an armed individual, or they have to do a containment of a house where there might be a barricaded armed individual. And so I think the frequency happens a little bit more in the sense of that emergency is happening right now. And in the moment, if you're deploying without it and you need it because there is a threat, going back and getting it like where you can with the Bearcat seems to cut down on that time. So I'm trying to figure out, how do we keep it as a value statement of this is important as a police department, as a community, this is important, but understanding that operationalizing it could be completely restrictive and prohibitive because the population that we're trying to protect could be in any or approximate to any scenario we're faced with. And so I think that's kind of the challenge I see on both sides.
Thank you. Ms. Tu.
Thanks, and I really appreciate that we're taking the time to continue to have this conversation, because for myself, I still find myself very confused about the hesitancy around this, because I hear the values alignment from the department, and I hear the interest in recognizing when there are vulnerable populations present and making an extra effort to protect our most vulnerable neighbors. And given that the language is not, the language is not an outright ban. The language is talking about effort, and it's saying, look around, notice, and if you see that there are people in a vulnerable population present, think about whether, just take a moment and think about whether there's a way to do this that doesn't involve bringing out this weapon. And going back to Vice Chair Jordan's, oh, got it on the first time. Going back to Vice Chair Jordan's comment, I want to remind everyone of something that happened recently, but not in Oakland, but across the Bay. And that was in San Francisco, when two men were killed by SFPD. And this was last year. And in this situation, there were two men, both unhoused, and they were grappling on the ground. One of them had a knife. And a number of SFPD officers were present. They ended up shooting both men with first special impact munitions, the less lethals, and then also with multiple types of firearms, including a rifle. At least one officer who was present was aware that one of the men did not speak English. He was aware of who that person was. He was aware that he did not speak English. And that's the situation that I think about when I see a need to protect people who are not proficient in English. We're not asking you to make a determination of did they of their English proficiency, but to make an observation. Like, are you getting a complete blank look when you give a direction? Is it possible that the person doesn't understand you? Is it possible that they don't understand you because of a mental disability? Is it possible they don't understand you because they aren't proficient in English? And so this isn't about you have to make an exhaustive determination. This is asking you to make that full effort to consider whether there are people who are vulnerable who are present, and to remember that sometimes vulnerabilities aren't always going to be physically obvious. Someone might look like they should be as fully able-bodied as you are, but they might not be. And that's what this is saying, is remember that these people are our neighbors. These are people of Oakland. Let's take just a little bit extra effort to acknowledge that they exist and that they matter, and we should avoid deploying weapons when they're here.
Mr. Lindsay Pollard.
Well, I see you, Commissioner Shea, you're already looking for some alternate language here. I guess I have a question, which is, I mean, I hear what Commissioner Jordan and what members of the department have said about it's almost impossible to know, and it seems to me that the armored vehicle is also deployed in neighborhoods frequently. Like I looked at the last monthly reports, it's about twice a week, where it could be very difficult to know. And I guess what I'm wondering is whether that policy on armored vehicles, how you implement it. How does the department actually implement that piece of the policy? Is there, what is the standard that the department is using just to recognize whether a commander has made efforts to avoid deployment of armored vehicles in the presence of those vulnerable populations? Or is it just not being implemented? I mean, maybe what I'm hearing you saying is, actually, when we wrote this policy, we didn't recognize how hard it would be to implement, and in the fact, we're not really implementing it, which would be important to know too. So, I mean, I do see this other language that might begin to express the values of the department around vulnerable populations. But I am curious in terms of the existing policy, where, I mean, the armored vehicle is out is like in the neighborhoods, that's where you see it, right? So how does the department actually implement this piece for armored vehicles?
Vice Chair.
I agree. John, you and I both worked on that policy. And it's we did revisit that policy as part of this ad hoc, but the bulk of that work was, done last year, 2 years ago. And I think that this is one of those things where policy making is sometimes an iterative process, where you write your best version of the policy given what you know at the time, and whatever resources, personnel you have available, and whatever the sort of dynamic is. And maybe what we wrote in that was something that was not wholly feasible, or easily sort of lived up to by the department. I'm seeing sort of what Jesse is the track he's going down. And that's kind of what I was going to say is what Jennifer was saying was not essentially every effort should be made, but there should be an effort made to ascertain whether there are vulnerable populations at risk in this activity. And in that situation, there should be an effort made to mitigate the risk to those vulnerable populations. That's what I heard Jennifer saying. I'm more comfortable with that language, significantly more comfortable with that language, because it's more precise than just saying we should make every effort to not use it if there's any of these potential demographic, groups present, which is impossible to sort of ascertain at all times, right? But if we're saying you should be on the lookout, which is what Jennifer was saying, are there people who are behaving as though they don't understand what you're saying? Maybe they don't speak English, maybe they don't hear. Maybe they are, mentally, they have mental health challenges and so forth, and are just not hearing you also. Children, so forth. We've discussed sort of the presence of children when discussing flashbangs, things like that. I think this falls into that same category where there's an effort made to be sort of cognizant of presence of any vulnerable populations and then make every effort to mitigate the risk, right? Does that feel closer, John, Jennifer, to maybe the spirit? Because I get that, like, council president had a thought. I feel like that thought was maybe, handed to her by one of the two of you, or at least in conversation with you. It feels like she has had conversations and you maybe are sort of advising her or others on how to proceed with this. And, that's great. But she's not been here for the conversations and sort of processing all of the other variables and dynamics in relation to this. And I think that maybe something more precise would be super helpful, regardless of what the council thinks.
Lieutenant Toribio. By the way, I have not been making edits. I just added these things, so I don't know what y'all are talking about quite.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thanks. I agree wholeheartedly with virtually everything you said. I do want to answer a question that was asked, and then also give kind of what I think will be the last thing I feel I can contribute to this regarding vulnerable populations and armored vehicles and efforts that are made. So things that we teach in training, and I can't recall if it's specifically in the document, but routes from place of storage to the location, placement of the command post where the armored vehicle is going to be staged. All of those things are now considered with an emphasis on the effect of the armored vehicles on vulnerable populations. An example would be, looking back in the past, a church or a school parking lot may be the absolute ideal position for placement of a command post in relation to where a critical incident is happening. However, understanding the effect that some armored vehicles may have just in their presence on vulnerable populations, now there's more thought and consideration into placement of our command posts and where this equipment's going to be staged and therefore in public display. So that's kind of how, at least for the armored vehicles, we consider vulnerable populations. So we teach also all of our people who deploy armored vehicles, hey, consider the route. Like, if you can get from, don't just think A to B, most efficient route. Like, if you're going to be driving by a school or a hospital or like a daycare center or whatever, don't take that route. Like, loop around. Try not to try to minimize the impact of this thing even just driving around. So hopefully that in part at least answers some questions about how that's addressed in the training bulletin for armored vehicles. But back to K6, in addition to what the vice chair said, I think also what language in one policy, it just may not exactly translate in the same spirit to another policy. And that's how I think I feel with K6 and the training bulletin for armored vehicles. I think what's being said here regarding vulnerable populations and exposing them to things that may adversely affect them isn't just about rifles. It's about all uses of force, and an extension, these force options and the actual tools. And this is already covered in K3. So by, I think, adding this explicit language here and using that current language, it's leaving the impression that it's a special inclusion for like rifles. And I just ask for a little sensitivity on this opinion from like a member of a party who it would be deploying in the field with these things under this condition in the shall, and seeing how it could potentially be a violation of the written letter here. And that's just a concern. So I again, just as that was presented through council, I have I just kind of have a problem with that shall statement. The wholeness of use of force is always about the weight of the intrusion versus like the government interest in apprehension. And, this is laid out in good detail through collaboration with everybody, community included in K3. The more I think we put here specifically for K6 in the verbiage that it's written, I don't think it's a good idea.
Assistant Chief.
Thank you. So a couple things. From a context standpoint, I know that, and it sounds like we're talking about the words that say shall make every effort to avoid. And then when we have a discussion about, we're talking about it should be something that we consider. And I do see those as kind of two nuanced but a little different type scenarios. I think, we want to use it in the best possible way to provide safety, but also to keep in mind that there could be, factors that maybe we don't need it. And by just doing it and deploying it, it could affect vulnerable populations. And I say that because I go back to the armored vehicle policy. That section is in there, and it is in there under pre-planned operations. So it is giving you time to think about, plan, kind of what Lieutenant Turbio was talking about, come up with routes. And that is a very thoughtful way of doing it, along with after that statement is made, it creates more context around it. It says, okay, well, you shall avoid, and the way you shall avoid is consider these things, but it's not just consider the presence of minors and vulnerable populations, but also consider, whether or not the individual is armed, whether or not there's a history of violence. And so it in the reader's mind, it's just not you shall avoid, it's you shall avoid. And what that means is consider these things as you go through. And so I think if we're trying to kind of meet in the middle, it's not just putting that in of make every effort to avoid, but make every effort to avoid through a considering of different factors, not just for not deploying, but for actual deployment. Very similar to what we do with our pursuit policy. We have risk factors, for example, and when we're engaged in a pursuit, there are several things we have to consider on whether or not we want to continue pursuit or cancel pursuit: speed, traffic conditions, presence of pedestrians, time of day, road conditions. It doesn't mean any one of those causes you to cancel, but it's saying when you do this, consider it. So I think that to wrap context around the statement of just make every effort to avoid, it really should include or be replaced with, and it probably take away commanders, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, officers can actually deploy patrol rifle officers. So, officers shall consider the list of these things, including the presence of vulnerable populations. So that's just my 2 cents of I think we're all trying to get to the same place without making it completely an average reader going, well, that means I can't ever do it, and taking it out of context. When really what we're trying to say is just think about it when you do it and consider it. And if, to Mr. Lindsay Pullen's point, if there is an alternative that is safe and feasible and doesn't require it, then that could be an opportunity. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Miss two.
Ronbun. I have a question for the department. I remember Lieutenant Turner had talked about training on some weapons and talked about how the point of the training isn't just be sure you can aim and hit the right spot, but there's also training on when you don't want to shoot the weapon. And I'm wondering if any of that training around not shooting includes any situations with vulnerable populations. And I'm sorry, but I cannot remember which weapon it was.
Yeah, this was around rifles, so I'm going to defer to Lieutenant Toribio. He has taught much more recently than I.
Thank you. Yes. So part of in-service training that we do, not only for rifles, although as one of the primary rifle instructors, I have included this in yearly or quarterly training that we have, is we run reality-based training scenarios dealing with various types of subjects. And one vulnerable population in particular that we have included has been people with suffering from a mental health emergency. So we obviously preach different tactics depending on the type of individual that you're encountering. One of the main differences in how you communicate with them. So if I'm giving somebody commands to gain compliance, we're going to give those differently and speak to them differently if they're an armed robbery suspect versus somebody who's having a mental breakdown and is armed with a gun. So we do incorporate these types of scenario-based training, not only in our patrol rifle program and tactical team, but also in our in-service training. Now, I haven't worked directly for the training division, but I have attended training, and I know the staff is still including these types of reality-based training scenarios.
Ms. Two.
I think that was the answer I was kind of hoping for. And if the department is already training to identify these scenarios, then it sounds like the what we've been talking about around identifying when someone encounters someone who is a vulnerable population member, that identification process is already something the department is training for. And so I'm not sure how much we need to be concerned about that. And so I'm wondering, am I missing something? I'm hoping the department can let me know one way or the other.
So are you asking, are you missing something in terms of why we might still have some qualms about the language as proposed in the city council amendment?
Right, because you're already training for it. So
right. Yeah. So I think that we're kind of conflating two things. Vice Chair Jordan kind of said it best. Yeah, we already teach and we train about identifying vulnerable populations in multiple instances. I don't think it's an issue of that. Nor is it really an issue of when we are the person we are in front of that we are dealing with and trying to find alternate resolutions. The issue we have is really around the language of shall make every effort to avoid this deployment in the presence, because there's two things. There's two main areas. The shall make every effort is, as Vice Chair Jordan put it much more eloquently than I, overbroad. And then in the presence is does not just talk about the person you are engaging with. The presence could be anyone. I'm in the presence of my neighbors right now, though they have no idea what it is that I'm doing. So those are the two areas. I don't think the department has any issue in terms of that we are addressing and working to address when we engage. It's those two areas.
Mr. Lindsay Pollard.
I see Commissioner Shea beginning to respond to some of the departments. So the immediate presence of, I think, is a helpful, although, of course, if rifles are coming in and out of my block all the time, I appreciate that the armored vehicle might be parked in a different place, which is, I don't know whether that's immediate presence or just in the presence of. So, and I also appreciate shall make efforts to avoid, because it does seem like the department is already in some ways doing these things. So again, I'm thinking about whether the department is fully implementing the armored vehicle policy. If you use a strict definition of what you're finding problematic here, you're probably not fully implementing the armored vehicle policy. But that's not the definition that's not the interpretation of that language I necessarily would have had. So anyway, I'm appreciating the language that Commissioner Shea is putting in.
Commissioner Jordan, Vice Chair Jordan.
So again, I think speaking to John's point, I think that as noted before, that piece, this language within the armored vehicle policy is specific to planned activities. Not all deployments of patrol rifles have the same level of planning. So maybe cannot necessarily be held to the same level of sort of forethought around sort of environment. I think though that if, and I go back to what Jennifer said when she was sort of, advocating for this, is that what we really want to see is commanders or just officers are making an effort to identify the presence of vulnerable populations and seeking to mitigate any risk to those populations during the deployment of patrol rifles, as opposed to every effort to avoid the presence, which again just feels a little broad and doesn't actually get to the sort of like the thing we want them to do, which is just be cognizant of the people around you. Do they fall into a vulnerable population category, and how can you mitigate risk to them if needed, whether they are the subject of that deployment or they are, a bystander. I think is, that's my thought on that as far as language goes.
What happens if I use, so recognizing that this particular paragraph is under a section that under authorized deployment and specifically calls out things that must be considered prior to deploying a department rifle. And the first three generally relate to things related to the suspect, which might talk about sort of factors, the presence of which would mean deploy your department rifle. What if we just use the section I have highlighted, which is in red in context, the following factors shall be considered prior to deploying a department rifle: avoiding the deployment of patrol rifles in the immediate presence of minors, elderly, medically compromised people, people with physical, mental, or intellectual disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, or other vulnerable people. In my mind, that provides the value statement of we don't want, if it's avoidable, the deployment of patrol rifles in the immediate presence of these vulnerable populations. But certainly is when it comes up on review and a use of force review, and a question, you knew that there were kids there, why did you deploy this rifle? Thoughts? Lieutenant Toribio?
I think that's great. I think that satisfies it, keeps things in the spirit of deployment and keeping that in the consciousness of the rifle person and in training when we're teaching this document and incorporating it into quarterly trainings. So I think it's perfect.
I will note that I did not specify commanders or officers because there are provisions in K6 that talk about both. I think it's assumed that patrol rifle officers can self-deploy, but also when commanders may direct patrol rifle officers to deploy. Assistant Chief?
I actually may have answered my own question. So yeah, it would be under the 9B where it's the following factors shall be considered prior to deploying the rifle. 1, engaged person. I see it now. And then it would basically essentially be a .4 that says avoiding the deployment.
Yes, that's where the language was to be inserted, the original proposed language.
Got it.
So I'm just changing the first portion of it, since
Okay.
there's already a shall in the list.
Yeah, the following factors shall be considered. Okay, I got it. I'm tracking with you now.
So Lindsay Poland, this too.
I wonder if we can hear the 2 members of the public who wanted to speak on this, had their hands raised for a little bit.
Sure. So time check, we got 3 minutes left. Everyone okay to finish up at least the proposed, the ones from the proposed resolution? I think that's probably going to be about 15 more minutes or so. Not guessing, not promising, but I'm just going to keep going. Let me know. Start with Mr. Farmer.
You know, I was going to say something earlier, but I just didn't get the pushback on the language. Ms. Two pretty much covered a lot of what I wanted to say. But, you know, this is definitely, it's not symbolic. This is definitely not something that you don't want to have on your mental checklist if you're authorized to potentially use deadly force. This is the population that you decided to serve and protect. This is the city that you decided to work in. So I think you definitely need to make every effort to protect them. And the pushback to try to, I don't know what, to try to do what, but the pushback just didn't make any sense to me. You know, this language not only protects the public, but it protects the officers from having, you know, to go through some sort of mental health issue if they do make an, you know, honest mistake or something like that. That's all.
Thank you for your comment. Let's see. Risa.
Yes, thanks. This is Risa Jaffe. Yeah, I've heard some of what I wanted to say also. But I just want to add, when I heard the city council reading off this list, the thing I wondered is, why don't we want to always be considering before we deploy a department rifle? Like, isn't our goal to keep people safe without harming other people? So I really don't understand the pushback. The police, as I understand it, the job is to keep us all safe, including them. And, you know, when you bring a rifle out, that increases risk of harm. And so why wouldn't you just automatically, regardless of who the population is, be considering every possible option? And so I, too, am concerned about the pushback on this, because it makes me feel like the police aren't interested in considering what other options are available when I hear the pushback. We've certainly seen videos of police misconduct where there were no consequences for that. And we always get told, well, there was no policy that addressed that. And so I'm hard pressed to think that some wording here is going to cause a problem, and it could provide value into really saying the culture is to deploy something else whenever possible. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. Lieutenant Turner.
Yeah, thank you. I think you know, part of my sort of New Year's resolution is to try and avoid letting things bottle up. So I do want to, just in terms of the concept of pushback, I'm just going to leave it there. But just want to point everyone to the mission, purpose, and core principles that's in Department General Order K3. Is written policy, is something that's taught to every member of this police department, does include things like Section A8, commitment to serving members of the community with physical, mental health, developmental, or intellectual disabilities. So I do want to just remain intellectually honest that the department and the staff, we really want to set the staff up for success and want to make sure that the policies are something that they can work with, that they can understand, that they can implement correctly, but that our values have been there, continue to be there, and are the ones that we operate under. So I appreciate the opportunity.
I like a little bit of awkward silence to get people thinking. Mr. Lindsay Pollitz.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Risa Jaffe just said, and also what I had said earlier that the department also responded to about alternatives, which is not really shown, not really referenced here. And I do think that that's a if the way policy is constructed helps our patterns of thinking about what to do, then it seems to me that a reference to shall first consider alternate, less force options or something like that, or de-escalation, or alternate ways of accomplishing the objective, or what, or alternate means of achieving safety, public safety actually would be the bigger umbrella, right? Rather than just saying avoid, but because if you don't have an alternative in your mind, and you're not being trained to think about those alternatives first, then it's still going to seem like the only game in town. So avoiding, that's where the phrase chilling effect came in earlier, right? But if you have part of your the way that you're thinking about it, the criteria is also involves first considering, and of course time is always a factor, but if you're able to first consider other means of achieving safety, community public safety, that to me seems like an important piece of this.
Vice Chair.
Yeah, so I feel like I need to respond to the sort of all the concern around the pushback around this. I feel like I made at the outset of this topic, made my concern around the pushback clear. I feel like this language is imprecise as to be ineffective. John Lindsay Poland is talking about how it's potentially ineffective within the Bearcat policy, or the armored vehicle policy, in which I think it is actually more appropriate. So if it's potentially ineffective there, I think it's very ineffective potentially here, in that it is either so broad as to be symbolic and not necessarily enforceable or useful, or potentially leaves the officers in a situation where they can be sort of called out for a thing that may have been impossible for them to even recognize in hindsight, which is something that happens sometimes in disciplinary issues. I am on board with the spirit of this language. I just think that the language should be tailored so that it actually gets to the thing that was very specifically stated by Jennifer earlier. What I heard her say was not necessarily what this language says, but that there should be an effort made to identify populations and reduce risks to them. And I fully agree with that. And I feel like that is in line with what all community members have expressed, protecting vulnerable populations by awareness of and caution. As far as sort of de-escalation and its sort of primacy in this situation, I think that is, I have a child standing behind my shoulder all of a sudden. I think he needs to get tucked in a minute. So after I'm done talking, I'm going to leave and tuck my kids in. I think that is more and more baked into the cake. It is built into so many of these policies. It is a very important part of use of force policy, and it's here in this policy as well. I think that if our goal is to protect those vulnerable populations, there's better language to do it, and that I'm on board with that. Let's do that. But I think this is broad and sort of absolutist. I recognize that shall make every effort is not necessarily, he's literally trying to get on my lap now. Shall make every effort is not a full-on prohibition, but depending on how you identify that language and determine what every effort means, could be paramount to a prohibition. So I just think that you know, I'm going to tuck you in a minute. I think that we need to strengthen the language and make it more precise so that it actually does the thing we want to do. That's my feeling on it. And I don't feel like this is me pushing back against the spirit or idea. This is me trying to get to a place where it's actually doing what I want. I'd like to see it do. I gotta go. Sorry. I'm actually gonna exit the meeting. I'm gonna go tuck my kids in, read them some bedtime story. Bye, everyone.
Good night. So in one last effort to try to get some sort of consensus, I've have this other paragraph that says commanders and officers shall make efforts to avoid the deployment of patrol rifles in the immediate presence of minors. Doesn't say every effort, just say shall make efforts. Could I get thoughts?
Can we say reasonable efforts? I don't know if that helps.
Commanders and officers shall make reasonable efforts to avoid the deployment of patrol rifles in the immediate presence of, I'm just going to say, vulnerable populations. As a catch-all for now, recognizing that that's not every person in there is necessarily vulnerable, but
I think that's fine.
you liked this earlier, Mr. Lindsay Boland.
Yeah. I think it's good. I'm still thinking, but yes, it's good.
Sorry to call you out, but the hour is getting late.
And you're waiting for me, I guess.
So here's because we're getting at a late hour. I tend to, unfortunately, be in the middle of everything where I agree with everyone, and I'm just trying to figure out a way to make everyone happy. Because what everyone has brought up are really good points, are really good considerations. We are, of course, building a policy that will be used for many years down the line. We want to be both cognizant of all of the considerations of protecting the people of Oakland, as well as making clear policy so that officers know exactly what to do, right, and are not set up for failure. And so to the extent that we can do that, I'm trying to make it so that there is some consideration, some reasonable consideration. Reasonability is a word that I don't like that often when I have to deal with it, but it certainly, I think, gets at what we're talking about here, which is think about what you're doing. Think about what you're doing, but also gives enough flexibility where if there's just an incredibly dangerous situation, there is no real effort that could be reasonable, but we also want that in sort of thinking about the preservation of life. We don't actually, I can present, because this is not the final word, of course, I can present what I would think is probably going to be one of multiple options to the commission when this comes up, because frankly, I don't think we're necessarily, seems like we're really close, and I would like to get to a point where we are in agreement. But if not, then I can always present alternatives to the commission. We can present alternatives to the commission. I'm sorry, Ms. Tu.
I don't dislike it. I haven't quite decided if I like it. And I think for myself, the hour is late, and I would appreciate having a little bit of time to come back if we do have that time, and I'm not certain if we do. That makes me wonder when we next meet and when that will be relative to the timeline.
Okay. Assistant Chief, are you about to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I know we're trying to wordsmith as it gets late, but I was just thinking, and I'm not trying to add more alternative language, but just as a consideration, if it is going to be 0.4 under the following factors shall be considered, just for the kind of flow of how it says, basically the engaged person is, and then 0.4, whether there are the immediate presence of minors and elderly and medically compromised, so on and so forth, or other vulnerable populations, and alternatives to deployment. Maybe that is, so it's kind of a flow of, you shall consider all these things, and you should consider whether there's presence of these populations and alternatives to deployment. So we're talking about consideration and alternatives. It seems to me that in the consideration, it would flow on all these considering factors. So I kind of throw that as a possible suggestion as well.
Maybe new sentence of in that situation, and then what you just said.
Yeah, in that situation, the immediate presence of the list of vulnerable populations and alternatives to deployment. Deployment.
Don't worry, Lieutenant Turner, I've got you.
I'm not sure if that was autocorrect or not.
Perhaps deployment of the rifle. I really appreciate your adding in the reasonable alternatives. There is something about this, well, first there's the question that Jennifer asked before about what is the efforts that the department already makes to identify those people in an incident situation. That seems kind of important piece of this, but then kind of it's an overall thing, not just for the department, but for any of us. Like when there's vulnerable people around, we make an extra effort. It's just kind of a basic ethical commitment that when there are more vulnerable people around, we have to be more committed because they're vulnerable. So there's something about that making an effort that seems important to me as a kind of personal ethical piece. So it's just fun.
Let me ask council really quickly, if you're still here. I heard from the city council meeting that the deadline was March 20th. What's the turnaround for getting stuff on a city council agenda? And in turn, what will our deadline be?
I don't know the turnaround for city council to get on the agenda, so I'm sorry, I can't answer that one, but usually they post the Friday before their Tuesday meeting. And they meet twice a month. With regards to your question of the city council is triggering a language that is asserting a language in AB 481 around the 180 days, and that's why they are framing this as an October to end of March timeframe. The municipal code has this within the 120 days, and so it would be beneficial for the commission to get this to the city council before mid-February, so that we would be able to stay within the framework of the municipal code. And I don't, if you need me to opine further around the nuances of the city activating the Charter Code 604B, I'd be more than happy to talk about it. But I think there's some differences in opinion that we need to make sure to still take care of our responsibility and our authority. And so my recommendation is, if we could, to the extent possible, get this to the commission at its 26th commission meeting, so that we can immediately then deliver this to the city council. That would help tremendously in terms of how we frame this for the commission.
What was the turnaround for when we approved policies the first time for it to get on council's?
It was
agenda?
rather immediate. It was rather, we had adopted, I think, early part of October, our commission, and it got on the I think the October 13th council meeting agenda. So it's rather immediate.
All right. And then to sort of get a quick preview, where's the department's position on the robot changes? Or sorry, the amendments to the robot policy?
So from our standpoint, we have no prohibitions or no disagreement with the removal of OC as a use of force, so we could add that as a prohibited use. And then I think looking at, I think it's going to be more cleanup language, looking at the page 7 of the robot policy, where it says the rotating robotic arm should not be used as a force on a person. We just replace rotating robotic arm and just say the robot should not be used as a force object. So basically saying that outright, and then prohibiting however we want to add it, the OC piece of it for deployments. And then we can go ahead and add that in there. Again, no disagreement with that. The only thing we want to make sure is, we did have a lot of debate about, and I know we have it as a footnote about, there's certain things like trying to get someone's attention that's not necessarily a violation of this policy or considered a use of force. So I'd ask that we make a clear statement that the robot shall not be used as a force, but we don't consider that type of use to try and get somebody's attention or to, pull them out of a dangerous situation, that we would keep that in there as a footnote.
Okay. Great. What are y'all doing on Monday?
You mean other than hanging out with you?
Can we return on January 23rd for a follow-up to try to get things done on the 26th? I don't like cramming these things in, and I don't want to. I feel like we are about a meeting away from a lot of these things.
I'm not excited for this suggestion, but should we pencil in the Wednesday as well, or just the Monday?
The Wednesday is going to be too short.
Okay.
That's how we ended up with the whole thing around the robots.
And is the is the Monday in time for the Thursday meeting?
Yeah, because it's a 2 or 3 day post.
Okay, so police commission is Thursday the 26th.
Yep.
Okay.
I want to make sure that we'll have all of our department partners available
On Monday.
I will move the other ad hoc meeting that Commissioner Vice Chair Jordan and I are on. And we'll Monday the 23rd. Monday the 23rd, 6 p.m. Thank you all for bearing with us. I would like to have gotten this done, but we need to do it right and take the time. Questions, anybody, or parting thoughts? Otherwise, we'll see you all on Monday, January 23rd at 6 p.m.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Much appreciation.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Right.